I must say, Spock, that the last two videos that you've made brought up quite a few good points, although I don't entirely agree with everything said in them. Nonetheless, they do bring certain issues to the forefront that I think need to be addressed. And really, these points that you were making aren't so obvious to most anarcho-capitalists, in my experience and in the experience of the feedback that you're largely getting. It seems quite clear to me that most anarcho-capitalists, in fact, are not conscientious of these points. But
Most market anarchists. Well, maybe. But I knew that private property was violently enforced, like the state. In fact, let me read for you a passage from my booklet, which I posted in video form on YouTube over 8 months ago. For example, I'm starting a little bit in this section here. For example, a claims association only deals with lands its members are living on. All land not being homesteaded by members of the claims association is not claimed by the claims association. If one wishes to live just outside the property of a person a part of the claims association, they will do so. A state, however, will claim a large body of land and issue a fiat decree, perhaps a property tax. That is, by living on land claimed by whoever makes it the state, you are said to be, quote, living within the borders of X state, close quote, and are subject to the laws and taxes of that state. The state does not acquire property in the same way non-state subjects do. This can get fuzzy in theory, but in practice it is not ambiguous as to what is and what isn't a state. For example, females may have different things they have to do to acquire ownership of land than men, but it would be silly to say that women or men are now the state. The ability of the state to issue decrees pertaining to anyone living in the area of their claim is based primarily on belief, the ideology of the state as being legitimate. This is not to say that individuals will like the state any more than they will like respecting the property of some crank, but that they will view such things as legitimate. Belief is what maintains private property, and private property is necessary for the buildup of capital and people producing things that other people want. Belief is also what maintains the state, which I consider a perversion of this belief structure. ... The state is maintained in the same way the claims association is maintained, primarily through ideology, belief in the state is legitimate, and through force at the margins. Let's just be clear, BP, that the person you are directing the bulk of your vitriol in the past, or like now apparently as well, understands this. That I understood this, right? I know you weren't talking about me, but also keep in mind that Neon understands this, Overmind understands this, Sepro understands this. So just know that lots of people who think you're retarded understand that private property is enforced in a manner similar to the state. It's just a difference in acquisition and scope.
I think we should be even more honest in that what you're essentially saying is that, at least in the terms that you are defining, or the way you're phrasing this here, the distinction between anarchism and non-anarchism breaks down. You're essentially saying that every possible option is authoritarian.
Yes, that is what he is saying, and that is correct. Glad we got that cleared up. Nice, short little video.
At least relative to those that disagree or have to submit to the circumstances. By your own definitions here, the only difference between anarcho-capitalism and statism is the modes of land acquisition. While beyond that point, any feature of authoritarianism involved is intact in principle.
Well, first off, we've got a broken word here, authoritarian. For example, let's say a bunch of black supremacists want to form an all-black supremacist private property plot. Like any other private property owner, they are excluding people they don't like. In this case, it's whites, Mexicans, and Jews. But because they are not attempting to claim more land than that which they can effectively homestead, they are, practically speaking, no more authoritarian than other property owners, except that your reception would be a little bit colder if you were caught trespassing, but I think your objection is more systematic than that.
So that's exactly one of the main grounds upon which I've rejected anarcho-capitalism. Except in your case, you concede these points and continue to support anarcho-capitalism in spite of this.
Oh, so you found a way to maintain ownership without the use of force. Or maybe you oppose ownership, period.
I must say that your position seems more honest in that you concede these points, but your position seems to be more along the lines of just sort of pragmatically endorsing authoritarianism anyways. And I suppose the main difference between me and you in that respect is that I do have objections to authoritarianism.
Similarly, I have objections to the scarcity of resources.
And I must add that authoritarianism, as it's generally understood in anarchist discourse and history, is more than just a matter of physical aggression, although that's definitely an important part of it.
Okay, did you catch that shift? BP's kind of tricky. He went from the violent enforcement of preferences, specifically land claims, to the mere non-violent enforcement of preferences. That is, you are not allowed to, well, more or less, express certain preferences in anarchy. So he makes it sound less retarded by verbaging it up, but that's what he's saying. So we have two definitions of authoritarian that BP is using. One, the violent enforcement of a claim, typically on land, and two, preferences that are enforced non-violently, like ostracism, boycotting, blacklisting, and they can be done so, like these ostracism, boycotting, and blacklisting work because of power relation imbalances. For example, a cult leader can get his members to conform through ostracism. Businesses can keep women down by blacklisting all women from getting a job, and a town can make life more difficult for Jews by boycotting them.
But, and I'm not trying to play a semantic game here.
Well, it doesn't matter if you're trying or not, because you're actually playing the game. They're playing the same stupid game you've been playing for a year and a half, saying that some non-violent preferences are not allowed in anarchy because, well, anti-authoritarianism.
But I'd like to clarify exactly what anti-authoritarianism generally is by people who proclaim themselves to be, because it's more about power relations than simple physical aggression.
Well, if you're saying that people should avoid abusive personal relationships, I don't think that's something anyone calling themselves an anarchist would oppose. If you're saying that firms can drive wages or prices below equilibrium or cartelize on a free market, then I would refer to you this wonderful site called the Mises Institute, where they do a fine job of debunking these claims, in my estimation. That said, we're all anti-authoritarians with regard to power relationships on the individual level, at least publicly. Now, I know you have some conspiracy theories about me trying to start a cult or something, but publicly, almost everyone you're talking to is anti-authoritarian in regards to power relations on the individual level, and if you're saying that firms can abuse via bargaining power, then you're just lost.
But to get back to the main point, this fact that anarcho-capitalism and statism are only really different in terms of the modes of property acquisition, or the land property acquisition in particular, is something that most ANCAPs will not concede. However, I must say that you engage in a error when you treat all notions of property as being equal.
I agree, BP, and I would say a state is much more authoritarian than a series of private property plots, and I would also say that some moralizing busybodies running around breaking up restrictive covenants are more authoritarian than restrictive covenants themselves. Though Spock does have a point that because authoritarian is defined entirely by what one perceives as authoritarian, any argument over what is more authoritarian involves appeals to the majority and personal preferences.
In terms of authoritarianism, as if all of them are equally violent or authoritarian in nature, because there are conceptions of freedom that do not support land property rights, or at least land property rights in the same sense that a neo-Lockean theory does. And if we understand a right to be, or at least an essential feature of a right, to be its enforceability through violence, at least down the line, a theory of freedom, or a concept of freedom, that does not support those rights in that sense, then they aren't authoritarian, at least in that sense. They are not staking a claim of legitimacy or sovereignty to be able to legitimately enact violence in that sense. So really, it is a bit of a misnomer to analyze all conceptions of freedom as if they all fit into the Neo-Lockean paradigm, when they clearly do not. Those of us that do not support Neo-Lockean land property rights aren't making an authoritarian claim. We're rejecting the authoritarian nature of that for precisely the reasons that you yourself are conceding.
Well, I know there are people who think we don't need to use violence to enforce private property. And Stefan Molyneux considers himself an anarcho-capitalist, so there's one person who calls himself an anarcho-capitalist that opposes the use of violence to enforce a claim. So does this guy Safnerism, or he did at least the last time I talked to him. He supported private property not violently enforced. There are plenty of anarcho-capitalists who think neo-Lockean property can be enforced non-violently. They're wrong, but they do exist. Right? And so your criticism of them is incorrect. And of course, Spock is not one of these people. As for your second definition of authoritarian, how would you go about preventing the nonviolent enforcement of preferences? That's a rhetorical question, I'll just say it. There are certain preferences that are authoritarian when enforced. These people need to be non-violently or perhaps violently prevented from enforcing their preferences. For example, an all-white gated community. They get some guff from a few moralizing pricks, but they're happy and the rest of the world more or less couldn't care less. Now, even if this were a society with non-violently enforced neo-Lockean property norms, you, BP, would still oppose this gated community because they hold preferences that you deem authoritarian. And note the only people who are butthurt are you and your gaggle of moralizing busybodies.
Also, while you concede many of these problems with voluntarism in its raw, ambiguous sense, and it is very ambiguous, you continue to be a voluntarist, essentially, in favor of a particular model under it. Nonetheless, you continue to be a voluntarist, and hence exemplify, while you exemplify exactly why I'm not one, while conceding all of the problems that would lead me to not be one. And this isn't to say when I say that I'm not a voluntarist, that doesn't mean I'm in favor of more violence. It means that I have an even more robust conception of freedom. And that's really what anti-authoritarianism is.
You desire that claims not be enforced. You oppose violent enforcement and the non-violent enforcement that comes from power imbalance. You are just stating what you want. A child can state what he wants. You don't have a more robust conception of freedom. You just restate the same preferences everyone has in an obfuscatory manner.
It is a more robust conception of freedom than can be accounted for by voluntarism. It objects to, it has a higher threshold, so to speak, for claims of power over people. While you yourself concede that there are these problems, you don't seem to object to that particular threshold. You have no problem keeping it at that low of a level. And I find that odd.
Again, what the fuck is authoritarian? If some guy doesn't want to hire white people, who the fuck are you to demand he hire white people? If some guy blacklists white people, and in response you boycott that guy, who's being more authoritarian? Does the man not own his shop? Anyway, BP, this video was breathtakingly vapid, as usual, and you mischaracterized the discussion, as usual. Your conception of freedom isn't more robust, it's less. You make it out like you're opposing more authoritarian behaviors, but you're really just saying certain non-violent enforcement of preferences aren't allowed, right? Having your value judgments override other people's and dictating what people can do on their property to the extent that you even support private property. And if you think I'm being a little bit hypermodal in my criticism of you, then fine. You want to get real? Let's get real. Have you ever been to a shopping center? Nobody gives a fuck about other people. Like without the state, without elections, nobody cares what other peeps are doing. Right? They're like right next to each other. They don't give a shit what other people are doing. Right? And so practically speaking, letting people do what it is they want to do is a proven way to not cause a whole lot of problems, as long as they don't have their heads filled with a bunch of crazy crap, right? A bunch of crazy aggressive crap. Now, if they are, for example, like racial separatists, then you could say that is crazy crap, but they're separatists, right? And what you're saying is that you want, and it's what you were talking about with this thick libertarianism crap, right? You were saying that there are certain values that people have to have, certain anti-authoritarian values, thick libertarianism. But this is like another one of these positive things, right? This is another an imposition, right? A moral, right? Some prescription that doesn't come about from the nexus of interactions of people's unfettered preferences, right? You're imposing something new into the system. You're imposing something statist. And practically speaking, when there's no politics involved, peeps leave alone, right? And if you want to cite the ghetto, well, we both you and me understand how ghettoized areas in the U.S. are largely, or I would say entirely, result of state intervention. So practically speaking, live and let live would work just fine. And hypermodally speaking, I'm more consistent than you. Right? That's all I wanted to say.